Welcome to Free Associations, the public health journal club podcast for anyone who's ever listened to a news story about a medical breakthrough only to have it contradicted a week later or wondered just how good those studies really are and wants to know more about how to figure it out for themselves. I'm Matt Fox, professor of epidemiology and global health at Boston University and an HIV researcher and an epidemiologist by training, so just to let you know, I have no medical degree. Before we get started, I do want to do a quick plug for the Population Health Exchange, Boston University School of Public Health resource hub for lifelong learning. You can find it at www.populationhealthexchange.org, and that's where you can find this podcast, as well as many other population health learning programs and tools, so go check it out. Today, in the first part of the podcast, we're going to be talking about a study that is making a lot of headlines. You may have heard about it. It's a study that asks the question of whether kids who have regular routines when really young are less likely to be obese at age 11. Then in the second part of the podcast, we'll get into the issue of how to critically read a journal article. So for those of you who want to learn more about how we do it, we'll give you our tips and tricks. And then in the third segment, our amazing and amusing segment, we'll talk about some studies and websites or other mediums that we've come across recently that made us laugh out loud or wonder how this study ever got funded in the first place, and maybe something that really amazed us, and then we'll ask how they did it.
We won't always give answers, but we'll ask.
We'll ask. We're much better at asking questions than answering them.
I think so.
Now, before we get into our first segment, let me introduce you to my two partners in this endeavor. I'm joined in this quest first by Dr. Chris Gill. Chris, can you introduce yourself?
Hey, good morning, Matt. Yeah, hi, Chris Gill here. So I'm an infectious disease doctor by training, and I'm an associate professor here at the School of Public Health in the Department of Global Health. And I guess I'm sort of an HIV researcher, and I also study bacteria that live in the respiratory tract.
Good times. Good times.
Yeah. Hello.
And we've got Dr. Don Thea. Don?
I'm just like Chris. I'm an infectious disease doctor. I'm also on the faculty of the Department of Global Health, where I'm a professor. And I've been doing field research, mostly in the area of HIV and pneumonia for just about my entire career.
All right. So let's move into the first segment of our podcast. So we're going to be talking about a new study using data from the United Kingdom by Sarah Anderson and her colleagues at The Ohio State University. And I like to say The Ohio State University, so I sound like I'm a professional football player on Monday Night Football. So from The Ohio State University, published in the International Journal of Obesity on the relationship between regular routines for 3-year-olds, for example, regular bedtimes, regular meal times, regular television watching, or less of it, and the relationship between that and obesity in those same kids at age 11. So the title of the study, if you want to follow along at home, is Self-Regulation and Household Routines at Age 3 and Obesity at Age 11, Longitudinal Analysis of the UK Millennium Cohort Study. And it's an early release publication. I have not yet looked, I haven't looked again online, but an early release meaning it has not yet come out in fully print formatted version, but has got a lot of media attention. So we'll dive into the details of the study, break it down, and try and see if we can end by figuring out what we think of the results. Before we get started, I want to lay down the ground rules that we've all agreed to. So we are going to be critical of the studies that we talk about here on the podcast, but let's say right up front that there is no such thing as a perfect study. All studies are prone to bias, even randomized trials, as those of us who are sitting here at this table very well know.
Oh, yes, we do.
We've made a few mistakes ourselves. And because there's no perfect study, all studies are subject to critiques. And so our idea here is not to simply poke holes in studies, but rather we want to be thinking critically about how we consume medical and public health literature and give some insight into how we make decisions about what to believe and what to be skeptical about. So that's the idea of the podcast for those who are trying to learn more about how to do this or just learn what these studies are about. And so to do that, we've picked some topics that deal with studies that are hot in the news. So not necessarily topics, in fact, intentionally probably not topics that we're experts in, because I don't know about you, Don and Chris, but
I'm not an expert in anything.
We all know that. That's why we asked you here. I get friends and family members who ask me all the time about the latest story they've heard on NPR and want to know whether or not it was a good study. And I know nothing about it because I have no time to read anything beyond what is in my narrow field of HIV epidemiology.
Do you have a stack of journals on your desk that
I
you also don't read?
I don't even stack them anymore.
You just throw them away right away?
I just
Saves time.
Yep, I just print them out and put them directly into the recycling bin.
Smart.
Yep. And so the idea here is that we want to be dealing with topics that we are not necessarily experts in, so that we can give you a sense for how we go about this when we pick up a study on a topic that we don't have the expertise on. And the last ground rule that I remembered last minute is we do need to remind ourselves that you, the listener, doesn't necessarily have the article in front of us, and so we will do our best to describe what it is we're talking about and make this more interesting. So, to get us into this study, before we get into the specifics, let me start by giving you some of the headlines that have been reported on this study. So I'll give you 4 of them. So the first one was from U.S. News and World Report that says, "Set family routines cut down on obesity study finds." NPR says, "Eat, sleep, repeat, how kids' daily routines can help prevent obesity." The Daily Mail's headline was, "Regular bedtimes make children less likely to be obese as adults. Scientists find link between family structure and behavior that affects possibility of gaining weight." And the Telegraph says, "Regular bedtimes stop children from becoming overweight, study finds," which is, I highlighted in bold, or I guess I bolded, in each of those words like cut down on, prevent, make, stop, because those are some pretty strong terms that suggest that at least the people writing these articles believe these are causal links between the two, and we'll actually try and figure out what we think about them.
Can I ask you a question?
You can.
Is an 11-year-old technically considered to be an adult these days?
In the eyes of whom?
The UK Daily Mail, which says regular bedtimes make children less likely to be obese as adults. If I'm jumping ahead here, were the subjects who were studied actually 11 years old?
They were 11.
That is an interesting definition of adult.
Yeah,
Let's just start with our critiques right there.
There you go. Well, then,
Sorry about that.
We'll try and figure that out. No?
Yeah, they're likely prepubescent.
Yeah.
They might be.
Yeah. So, Chris, why don't you start us off by giving us a summary of what this study was about, what they did, and what they found, and why they did it.
Okay, so I'm just going to say that I just flew in from Phoenix, and my arms were...
Well done.
No. Okay, we won't say that. But I did just read the paper while I was flying back from Phoenix.
I'm impressed you read it.
No, I felt I should before we started talking about it. So this is what we call in epidemiology parlance a longitudinal cohort study.
Yep.
Meaning that they enrolled a whole bunch of people. The study is actually technically called the UK Millennium Cohort Study. And they called it that because they enrolled a group of about 20,000 families who had a baby between 2000 and 2002, hence the millennium thing. Mm. And then they followed them over time, measuring all sorts of stuff to kind of gather data, and which would then allow them to analyze data and ask different questions and perhaps even answer them, which would be even better.
Not a bad idea.
Now, an interesting thing about this cohort, that the study that we are studying today is a subset of that full cohort, which is about 20,000 people. And here we're looking at around 10,000 kids who came out of that cohort. And an interesting feature of this is that the cohort is not entirely representative of the United Kingdom, but these are families who are, I guess to put it mildly, a little bit under stress. They're families who are almost entirely receiving government assistance. So this would be sort of the more of the socially disadvantaged.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you say when you say that, are you sure in the UK that's necessarily true? I mean, receiving assistance in the sense of they receive the child grant, but I think in the UK a child grant goes to just about everyone.
Oh, is that possible?
Yeah. Now they did. You
okay.
are right that they did oversample those who were in lower socioeconomic conditions because they specifically wanted to make sure they didn't essentially underrepresent those kids. But
so this is a very major difference between us and the United States.
Very major difference.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So in this study, what they wanted to look at was this link between bedtime routines and other household routines, and whether that led to a set of behaviors that could be measured in a survey called emotional self-regulation. And this is sort of like a way of sort of looking at a child and seeing, is the child able to resolve frustrations in an age-appropriate way? Can they kind of like calm themselves down, or are they more likely to be, difficult, sort of fussy, temper tantrum-prone children? And so, having defined this sort of personality trait, if you will, at the age of 3. They then looked way down the road at these same kids when they became 11 and tracked to see how many of them ended up becoming obese based on some standard definitions in epidemiology.
But they also looked at cognitive
Right.
cognitive effects.
They also looked at cognitive self-regulation. So there were 2 scales, but the one that they're most interested on here, and we will mention that there was this other scale, except that they didn't find anything. So we can not talk about that for the rest, because it didn't predict anything. And so it did not make its way to the newspaper.
Right, but they have an I think they have an explanation for that.
But the different parts of the brain, prefrontal cortex versus the limbic system.
Mature later.
I'd be curious to know how you'd score on the emotional.
I am quite sure after this
scale?
morning that not so well.
Yeah.
So these children who had more challenged emotional self-regulation were somewhat more likely to be obese. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I think they looked at both the scales, but they were more focused on the routines.
And the routines, right. So, we're going to talk a little bit about how we approach reading a journal article, and I'm going to jump ahead in here because I think
Foreshadowing.
that way of thinking about a paper is really essential here, because what the authors are arguing is for a sort of a causal model, meaning that, like, if this happens, then this happens, and then this happens, meaning that each of these things kind of interact in a chain of events that lead to something down the road. And that's really the whole crux of this, and I think where we're going to go.
That's where we're going.
Is whether we think that their causal model makes sense, or
Right.
whether it could be a little more complicated than that.
We will get into all of that.
And so their implicit causal model was that if the parents set up a set of routines so that the kids go to bed at a regular time and don't watch too much TV and have meal times that are at a regular time every day, that will lead to better emotional self-regulation.
That was certainly the hypothesis they were testing going in.
And then all of that sort of churned together in the slushy, what is it, smoothies? Like the fruit smoothie of epidemiologic good parenting. Ends up as a child who is less likely to be obese 11 years. No, at 8 years later. 8 years later, right.
11
That's
years old.
that's the nuts and bolts of this.
Yep.
And then they did some statistics.
And they did some, as happens in most medical.
You have to stick statistics in. It's absolutely necessary.
And they calculated p-values.
At some point, we will do a show on whether or not you actually have to put statistics in, but we'll come back to that. Okay.
They have a role.
There you go. So, beautiful. Appreciate that introduction. Don, let's start with you. So give us your take on this. Give us the highs and lows, what you thought was good and bad, and
Yeah, there were aspects of this that I liked. I like reading papers where I learned something new. I didn't know about emotional self-regulation. I didn't know about cognitive self-regulation.
Doesn't
In what
surprise me.
sense?
Yeah, I mean, it was a measure that I really hadn't been familiar with, so it was something that I thought was interesting. And the authors cite a fair amount of background information in terms of work that had been done previously to really allude to this association that Chris just talked about. And I think that it was trying to build on the prior work. And it's always good to try to build on work that has preceded it. And the authors, I think, feel good about the fact that their conclusions were consistent with the conclusions that were found previously, which is always a good thing. And it's always nice to be consistent.
No, I would say they're not all their findings were consistent with what they thought they were going to find when they went into it.
Yes, absolutely. I had a little bit of difficulty in my mind, as Chris was talking about, in believing the association of something that happened at such a time difference. That there would be one aspect of characteristics that they measured that existed when the child was 3 years old would translate to something that they observed when the child was 11 years old, because there's a lot of stuff that happens in the rearing of a child between age 3 and age 11. So I think that was something that I felt a little bit uncomfortable with. I think the fact that they were really relying on recall by the mothers. 98% of the respondents were mothers, in terms of what their routines were in the household. And I think that's always fraught with a little bit of inaccuracy. And that sort of made me a little bit uncomfortable. I also thought that that the scales that they provided. So what they did is they asked the mothers, do you, in your household, are your children seeing less than 1 hour of video computer time? I think it was 1 to 2 hours, and then 3 hours or above, or something like that. But they broke it down to 4 scales.
Yep.
And I think that sort of stacks the deck to a certain extent, because I think that people would feel as if there are socially desirable responses, and you're sort of leading the witness, as it were. I would have preferred that question were asked in a more open-ended way. How many hours of TV and video does your child watch on a typical day? So that made me a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, so I would. There is certainly research out there that suggests that the way that you ask the question can determine the way that people answer the question. So that if you categorize things in such a way that if you say, does your child watch, or how much TV does your child watch, and the lowest category is, say, 15 minutes a week, that immediately sets people up to be saying, okay, 15 minutes a week is a possibility.
Right.
So I want to be low down here. So maybe I'm going to choose the second category, even though I might be in the third category.
Yeah.
The question though becomes, and we haven't really said exactly what the findings are here. So we'll come back to that in just a second. But what's the likely impact of asking a question in that way? In other words, we know that if we ask questions certain ways, we're going to get misleading. We're going to get answers that do not necessarily correspond to the truth. But does that necessarily mean that we can't then correlate that measure with some outcome at a later point in time? And generally, I think what happens is when outcomes like that, or when questions like that are asked in a way such that you get misleading, you get inaccurate information, but it's not related to the outcome, we generally bias towards less of an effect. So maybe there's a strong correlation, and we observe a moderate correlation. It's more when we see things that are we ask questions that are both misrecorded,
leading questions,
questions, but that are also leading in a way that it's different depending on whether or not you got the outcome. That we tend to see really funky stuff going on.
Right, because surely the parents are aware that a lot of these relationships are going to be looked at.
Yeah.
So
socially desirable, but is there a reason to believe that you would answer the question differently based on whether or not your child 11 years later is obese, which you may have a sense for something that's going to happen because
which is tricky
obesity
because
may run in the family.
It's 8 years later, and so they wouldn't have known that the child was obese yet when they asked the question.
Exactly. So it may be that what's really going on here is you have some people who are miscoded because of the way that the question is asked, but the expected direction of that bias is such that it biases towards not being able to see an effect when in fact in some cases they saw an effect. I think we should go back to the actual effect. So what actually did they find here? And
maybe we could look at these routines that they describe at the beginning, because I thought that some of them were really kind of remarkable.
Yeah, so start off with the routines, and then we'll talk about what they found.
Well, I mean, the thing that sort of leaps out at me up front is the television exposure. So these are kids who are 3 years old, and about 78% of them are reported at the age of 3 as watching an hour or more of TV every single day. Mm-hmm. On average. Yep. I mean, it's like remarkable. It's a lot of TV for a 3-year-old to be watching. I was sort of like, that's interesting.
Seems like a bit less than I watched at 3. But,
Maybe but TV was better back then.
Well, obviously.
Yeah. On the other hand, most of them seem to have pretty regular bedtimes. As about 80% of them are reported by their parents as having regular bedtimes. But this goes right back to your social desirability, because this is like parents know this is the right answer.
Yep.
Do you put your kids to bed at a regular time every day? Wagging your fingers, you're asking the question. They're like, oh, yes, I do.
Of course I do.
Do you smoke around your baby with asthma?
No,
never.
No,
never. Right? I mean, it's sort of the same kind of, right? I mean, it's like, not to sort of go way off topic here, but there are all these sort of sexual behavior surveys where they ask like the number of partners you have, and the men always say, lifetime partners is 40, and the women all say lifetime partners is 10, and that on average it should be about the same. You
start to match it up, and you wonder who are they having sex with.
Mathematically, it should be equivalent.
Right.
And so somebody's lying, and probably they're both lying.
Right.
I mean, it's sort of, where does the bias lie?
Yeah. Right. But I do want to make the point, and I think this is really important, is that everything that we measure we measure with error. We get it wrong to some degree.
But the question is whether that error is biased in one direction or another.
Yeah.
And also, how much does it matter?
And how much is what matters.
And in which direction is it going to point us?
Yeah, and here I think we have a case where, at least for this particular set of variables, the exposures, meaning by exposures I mean the things that we are trying to figure out if they are causes of obesity, tend to bias towards no effect. I know there's lots of exceptions to that, but they tend to bias towards not observing effect if there truly is one, which people tend to use as a fallback for a way to say, aha, we found something, so you may be concerned about the way we measured this. Don't worry about it because, in fact, it was probably even a bigger effect, which I think is a big problem in general, and at some point we could do a whole segment on that. But let's get to what they actually found, because we haven't actually sort of said it.
Well, can we skip to table 4, which is I think where they get exciting?
I don't think the people listening have table 4 in front of them.
Okay, well, we'll describe it then.
Okay, paint us a picture of table 4, and in fact, table 5 I think is actually the one that has the
final.
That's a word picture, not word salad.
Okay, so remember, we're talking about a causal model here. So if you sort of see this is this happens leading to this, leading to that. These tables are sort of organized in the same logic. And so here we're at this point where we're looking at the association between these sort of these parenting behaviors, and the 3 parenting behaviors they looked at were regular bedtime, regular meal times, and the amount of TV the kids watched. And then what they're first looking at is do those 3 behaviors relate to this thing called emotional self-regulation? And the answer was...
Or cognitive self-regulation.
And cognitive self-regulation.
You really like that cognitive self-regulation.
But we're going to cut to the chase and just acknowledge that they found zip, nada, zilch on the cognitive self-regulation, so prefrontal cortex.
So I shouldn't bring it up again.
Talking to you today. So limbic system, we're all about the limbic system and the emotional score here.
I tend to agree with you. I think if you look at the regular meal times, they would probably say that there is some relationship, but I would agree with you. There's probably not
the P's are trending towards positive.
Yeah, they're significant.
Can we jump ahead to why you hate p-values?
No,
it's coming.
We need about
next time.
4 hours of therapy and an entire podcast for me to get into my hatred of p-values. But we'll
all right. So on
my
this,
therapist and I are working on it. Okay.
In this emotional self-regulation thing, the way they did it is they ask a series of questions, each of which has kind of like a scaled answer. And then there were like 4 or 5 questions in this. I don't remember exactly. But then they take the answers and they average them, and it comes up to a score between 1 and 3.
Yep.
And so the higher the score on this thing, in this case, ironically, the worse the emotional self-regulation of the child. And so a slightly higher score.
You want to be low, like in golf.
You want to have a good handicap here. And so what they found is that if you have children who sometimes or almost never or never have regular bedtimes, that their emotional self-regulation score was 2.1, whereas those who always had regular bedtimes, their emotional self-regulation, you're getting my mind, Don, their emotional self-regulation scores were 1.97.
Not your emotional mind.
And this difference between 1.97 and 2.13 was statistically significant.
Yes.
However,
meaningless.
We will make the pithy point that the difference between 1.97 and 2.1 is rather small in absolute verb.
I don't know that it's meaningless. I'm just saying what we don't know is what does it mean.
That's less than 1 emotional unit.
Right. It is.
And so the question is, what is an emotional self-regulation unit?
That is a good question.
0.1 and change was the absolute difference between the highest and the lowest.
Yep.
But it was significant.
Well, it was significant because because they had big numbers.
They had a wicked big sample size, 10,000 subjects. You're going to find...
Chris clearly grew up in the New England area.
So you would say that this study suffers from being overpowered?
Well, I wouldn't say that it suffers from being overpowered, right? I think the issue with p-values here, and this is not my general...
Please, no,
I'm going to contain it. But here the issue is when you have a big sample, the p-values start to become meaningless, and you have to look for what is the actual data telling us.
What is the magnitude of the effect?
Right. Yeah. And as Chris points out, here the difference is quite small. And I don't want to imply that I know enough to say that that's meaningless, which I think I did say, and I didn't really mean it.
We take it back.
Maybe 0.1 difference means something, but to the average person, I think you would look at that and say, probably not much going on.
Well,
there.
it totally doesn't line up with those headlines. I mean, that's the thing.
Well,
they're
hang on.
big
Well, wait.
effects.
So now you're talking about the relationship between cognitive and emotional scores and bedtimes cross-sectionally, meaning just We just looked at age 3 and we looked at whether they're related.
Right.
The headlines are related to table 5.
Oh, right. So do you want
Which
to
is the
take this one?
prospective
This is the beauty.
findings.
Right. This is the prospective stuff. So here's where we say, okay, let's look at these 3 different approaches to parenting: regular bedtimes, regular meal times, and limiting television use. And then at age 3, and we ask the parents about them at age 3, and then we look forward in time and we try to determine whether or not those kids are obese, and we look at how much more likely or less likely or not not likely to be obese as a child if you follow one of these routines. And they use some statistical modeling to try and account for the fact that these different models, these different routines would be correlated. If you're more likely to have a regular bedtime, you're more likely to have a regular mealtime. So we put them all together into one model. We also think about other things that might explain this effect. And what they find here is essentially that if you have if your child has a regular bedtime at age 3, they're about 2.3 times more likely to be obese. Times is a little bit of an overstatement because they're using odds and not risk, which is the way we normally think of our risk for things. So you're more likely, about twice as likely to have the child be obese at age 11 if they had they sometimes or almost never had a regular bedtime compared to if they always did. But if you look at regular meal times, the direction is exactly the opposite. So if you have a regular mealtime, if you sometimes almost never or never have a regular mealtime, you are less likely to have a child that is obese.
Slightly. Ever so slightly.
Well, no. I mean, the effect size is comparable to the increase that is related to regular bedtimes. They're just in the opposite direction. So, one.
So that's internally inconsistent, is what you're saying.
Well, I'm not saying it's internally inconsistent necessarily. I'm just saying it's interesting to me that they don't spend a lot. Well, I shouldn't fault the authors for this. The media spends no time focused on this. The authors spent a good amount of time talking about this is not what they expected to happen. But and then if you look at television, they found nothing. 3 or more hours of television. What is that, daily? Yeah, 3 or more hours of television use a day compared to up to an hour a day made no difference.
So the public health message is you can watch as much TV as you want.
If you believe, as you said, that they are following a causal model here, and there's nothing else that explains these findings.
All right, Mr. Epidemiologist, I have a question.
Okay.
I have some serious problems with some of the other data that was presented that might confound or explain part of this.
Ooh, confound.
fact.
Confound. Can you? What do you mean by confound?
You're going to tell. You're going to tell us
That's
what
what a
that
criminal
means.
does when he's looking for some money.
Confounds?
Oh, jeez.
Don't even know what that one means. I'm going to let that one go and just move on.
We'll edit that one out.
Confounds.
Yeah, we'll take it out in post.
Simplicit.
So there's 2 issues. One is that when you look at one of the tables where they break down the parents' education status,
And if anyone's following along at home, which table?
that would be table 3.
Yeah.
Table 3. I like that one.
And by education status, by income quintile, and also by ethnicity, there's a tremendous gradient in terms of these characteristics: bedtime, mealtime, and TV watching, where the parents who are more educated or the parents who are in a higher income quintile have children that are associated with a better bedtime score and a better mealtime score and a better TV watching score.
And were you surprised?
I was not. No, it's something that you would sort of expect. But to me, that should profoundly affect the outcome that we're observing. And the authors put that into their model. So they in the model, they looked at those
The statistical model.
the statistical model. They looked at those 3 covariates, and they quote unquote controlled for that. So my question to you, Matt, is that's a very common statistical approach.
Yep.
How good is it?
So the
Because I think that the effects that you see are really quite profound, and that socioeconomic status or income level could easily explain these characteristics. And then I have a follow-up question.
Okay, but before I answer the question, tell me why you're concerned. Why do you care? They're looking at television routines and bedtime routines and its relation to obesity. So why do I care about all this other stuff about the socioeconomic status of these kids or of the parents or ethnicity or things like that? Why do I care?
Because there are likely a ton of other characteristics that distinguish those various categories.
They're proxies for something else.
There could be all sorts of things. It could be, whether you have a healthy diet, whether you shop at a local store where you have access to good produce. It could be what is your exercise routine. If you're at a higher socioeconomic status, it could be that you're like all into marathons together or something, and that would be perhaps less likely.
I'm going to assume that 3-year-olds aren't running ultra marathons, but fair enough.
No, but it's the example that's set by the parent. So there's a whole world of possible other factors that are not bedtime, mealtime, or video watching that could explain part of this.
And that's the key. So the reason that we are concerned about these other factors is the confounding problem, meaning that we can have a situation where there are other factors that are related to the thing we're interested in as the potential cause, in this case, regular mealtimes, regular bedtimes, that are correlated with those things that are also explanations of the outcome, in this case, obesity. So as you say, if lower socioeconomic status is associated with differences in nutritional intake, that may explain the outcome, and you're going to observe that the regular mealtimes, regular bedtimes, whatever, are related to the outcome simply because the socioeconomic status is different in the kids who have regular mealtimes and don't, and then that's the real cause. And so your question was, how good are these models at dealing with this problem? And the answer is the models are very good at dealing with these problems with some caveats. And the caveats are the models can only remove this confounding problem. And the idea of confounding is that if we don't account for it in some way, then we can't actually observe the true causal relationship between our bedtimes and obesity. The models can only deal with it in the cases where A, you measured it, and B, you measured it well. So there are two different problems. Is if there are factors that are not in here that the researchers didn't measure, then they can't remove those confounding effects. Right. If they did measure it, the models can remove those confounding effects if and only if those variables are measured well. Just like we were talking about before, that you can have this problem where you ask people about their regular bedtimes, and people know what the answer is supposed to be, so they give you the wrong answer. Then that ability of the model to remove the confounding is reduced because you have this misclassification problem. So it works if and only if we measured it well. And when we don't, we have leftover confounding. We have some mixing of any true effects, if there are any, with any biased effects that are caused, or not biased effects, but any bias that is caused by these other factors that you're concerned about, kids running ultramarathons.
Yeah.
So I'd like to add and emphasize on Don's point, because I think this is a really important point in epidemiology and in the statistical analysis where we're trying to adjust for confounding, that this socioeconomic variables, the education of the family and the wealth of the family, are themselves proxies for all sorts of things that distinguish different kinds of families and impose different kinds of risks. So it's not that it's like, if you did a randomized trial and you gave people money and changed their wealth, it would not necessarily remove all of these effects, because it could also be that there is, there are other things that are important that are just represented by that number. And it's also true that the predictive variable, the one that we're really focused on, which is these routines, the bedtime, the meal times, and the TV watching times, are themselves proxies for a whole range of things that are involved in parenting, which we're not capturing.
Yep.
I mean, all three of us are parents. Mm-hmm. Right? And so we think I think that bedtimes and meal times and TV limitations are important, as I'm sure you all do. But that's not the whole thing about parenting, right? There's so much going on. There's like hundreds of behaviors behind those three behaviors that they measured,
right,
that will line up with these three. And yet, the takeaway message from the media is that all you need to do is change the kid's bedtime,
right,
and suddenly you've dropped the risk of obesity at 11 by half.
Right.
And that is preposterous.
Yeah, we don't buy it.
It's preposterous.
One thing that I'd like to see included in here, which I think would be a really important factor, is what is the BMI of the parents?
Right.
It's
You know,
really
the
interesting.
whole
They don't-
genetic aspect of it is just omitted.
They do get birth weight in here into these models, so
Oh,
they have
but
the birth weight of the child.
That's meaningless.
Self-reported, and they don't have that. Whether they didn't do a measurement on the child at age 3 to be able to adjust for the
weight already.
baseline value. So I agree with you. I think that's a problem. Chris, I think you raised the important point, which is there is a believability kind of thing that goes on when you read these things to say, okay, let's say I believe these results in the general sense. I think generally they did a good job, and I think they were getting at real effects. Does the size of the effect that they measured make any intuitive sense? So is it really the case? Do I really believe that if I just institute regular bedtimes for my kids at age 3, I can cut their risk of obesity in half?
Yeah, I don't buy it.
And that seems large. But I think there's another problem here, which is that, and this isn't, as I said, this isn't the author's issue so much as this is just a general consistency issue, and something that the media picked up on is the media focused on the what I'll call the positive finding, the thing that people want to know about, which is how do I reduce my kids' risk of obesity? The media does nothing to pick up the other side of the story, which is to say that it appears, if you believe this data, that instituting a regular mealtime for your kids will increase their risk for making them obese, which it doesn't necessarily seem intuitive. There could be explanations for it, right? It could be that setting regular meal times puts an emphasis on eating and consumption. So you could come up with all kinds of stories where it does make sense. But if you accept one, you have to accept the other. And as you say, then there's also the TV thing. So the message is watch as much TV as you want, because that clearly has no effect.
Which also seems preposterous.
It seems a little preposterous, but it also seems like, we certainly wouldn't want to spread that message, because the other thing we want to think about is, even if you buy this result, TV has other impacts on other things that so you don't make decisions based on the results of the effect of one thing on one other thing. Anyway, so I think we can.
So do we like a Siskel and Ebert thumbs up, thumbs down at this point? I mean, where do we stand on this?
Well, give me your takeaway.
I mean, I think generally I believe that the relationships they've defined are probably true. I think the magnitude of the effect is completely misleading. And I think the implications of what they have found, if turned into a set of guidelines by the pediatric societies, are going to be in some sense a wasted effort. I think they're way ahead of their skis on this.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I like the fact that it is consistent with the rest of the literature, and it is an attempt to look at this issue more rigorously because it's a prospective study. But I think, during the course of our conversation, we've identified quite a number of faults. I think it would be a really difficult study to do, because I think what you need to do is you need to have somebody in the household making observations about these things on a regular basis throughout the period of time until you measure your outcome. And controlling for all of the other things that we talked about, I think would be really, really difficult. So, I don't really buy this, but I don't think it disproves.
It's like if someone were to do a randomized controlled trial over 10 years of randomizing people to regular bedtimes or not, my guess is that they would find almost no effect.
But that's
whatsoever.
not a doable study.
It's not a doable study, but that would be my guess. That it's not really the bedtimes per se. It is those hundreds of parenting behaviors that are represented by the bedtimes, and the bedtime is just a proxy.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here, and I agree with you. I'm not ready to declare any of these to be causal links. I think what I would say is, and I think I'll probably say this about every study, short of the ones that I think just need to be totally discarded. What's that?
The ones you wrote.
No, those need to be
Those are
discarded.
perfect.
Those definitely need to be discarded.
More research is needed.
More research is needed.
Which is job security for us.
Exactly,
right?
and that's why we say it. I have it tattooed on my right shoulder.
Right.
That I would want to see more before I'd want to say that we should be able to go out and recommend these things. None of them seem in any way to be bad things to want to recommend. It's just that I'd want to know before I recommended regular meal times that in fact it was not harmful to kids in terms of obesity. All right, moving on to our next segment. So now that we've drawn our conclusions on that study, I wanted to go into more detail on something that came up in the first segment, which is I want to talk a little bit about how we, as consumers of the medical and public health literature, actually go about critically reading a journal article, and what is it that we're looking for, and how do we ultimately decide whether or not we believe something is a credible finding, or how do we decide if it needs to go into the trash bin? So, Chris, I want to start with you. So give us your take on how you, when you pick up an article or a new study comes out, how do you critically go through it, and what's your general strategy? What are you looking for?
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure. So this is going to come off as very cynical, but
You?
no, truthfully, I mean the sort of the central tenet of science is that you're supposed to be critically trying to disprove things as hard as you can. You're trying to be as skeptical as you possibly can. So your default position is always my default position, but I think it should be for all of us. The default position should always be, I don't believe it. Prove it to me. Prove me. Convince me. Convince me. And then if I'm convinced, then I'll sort of back off and say, okay, now I generally believe it. Now do I believe to the extent that they have claimed? And where are the opportunities here not to be like completely dead wrong, which was the first point, but where like we are slightly misled. This is where it gets into that confounding and bias issue that you were emphasizing. So I think that's my starting point. Is I always sort of say, my default is I don't believe it. Prove it to me.
Mm-hmm. And how do you deal with the fact that we know that all studies, particularly observational studies, by which I mean studies where we don't intervene, we just watch what people do, we try and draw conclusions because of that annoying fact that human beings have free will and get to decide for themselves what they want to do, and that leads to all these confounding problems. How do you account for that when you're reading? Because every study is going to have some problems. How do you set the threshold for when you say, no, I'm not buying it?
Yeah. That's a really. I mean, I don't know
it's
if I have
a question that I don't want anyone to ask me. That's why I'm asking you.
I think it's a shifting. I think it's a shifting margin. I mean, there was it's our God John Ioannidis. Is always saying that, like,
if he's listening, Chris there.
We really like your stuff, John. But he's always saying, like, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Except I think it was Carl Sagan who said that first. But
you like John just because he's almost as cynical as you are.
He is, and it is basically saying that if someone comes out with some very surprising, counterintuitive, finding asparagus prevents brain cancer, you're like, oh my God, I did not know that. I am going to go buy some asparagus now and I'm going to eat it every single day because I definitely do not want brain cancer. You might also say, what? That sounds like nuts. What is the possibility that that's just not true? And the crazier it sounds, the more likely it's to be wrong.
Yep.
And it seems like, that's obviously true. When someone says, I want to sell you a bridge for $50, this is the epidemiological equivalent of asparagus and brain cancer. I mean, it's like, why do we lose our skepticism when it comes to science? Do we suddenly oh my God, it's got to be true. It's in this journal that I never heard of before, but it's got to be true.
Okay, and if instead of asparagus it was ice cream, would you be more likely to believe it because you like ice cream?
I love ice cream.
So you're
like if they said ice cream improves quality of life, I'd be like,
that's got to be a good study.
Got to be true.
That's because you're completely unbiased, right, Chris?
Right. No, of course, I'm actually joking here, but I'm joking intentionally because I think that this is actually part of what goes on with the media, and I know this is not a segment riffing on the media, but I think that's what happens is the media picks up on things that people want to believe are true.
Right.
And as you say, that's the exact opposit of what we should be doing is looking at the things that are the more extraordinary things. We should be looking at the things that sort of, I don't want to say we only want to look at things that are logical because then we're going to miss the extraordinary thing when it comes along, but the extraordinary things are far less likely to be true because if they are truly extraordinary and impactful, those are often things that we just, we're quick to observe because you don't need a huge study. Smoking and lung cancer, why is that our big claim to fame? It's because the effects are huge. And so you start to notice the patterns in just clinical practice rather than having to start up with a big study.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's really important when reading articles like this to put it in context, to put it in sort of the environment in which the study was done. What are the other studies that led up to that? What are the other studies that are confirmatory about that? And I think that that's a real problem because, as the three of us know, and perhaps a number of our audience know, there's this concept of publication bias. So,
can you say what publication bias is?
Yeah. So the journals tend to publish findings that are splashy or positive because it makes better reading. They're more popular. They make more money. And they don't tend to publish the negative studies. So there is this bias in the literature that the findings that are positive are the ones that really become the prevailing truth, when in fact there's a lot of unpublished negative studies that would counterbalance those positive studies. So you really have to take that, take it into consideration and look at the whole landscape of scientific findings.
And I would add to that, journals also like to publish things that have statistically significant findings, by which I mean they use the statistical measure of the p-value. If the p-value is
Oh, here we go again.
below 0.0, I'm sorry, it's like just I can't avoid bringing it up. And there's all kinds of problems with p-values, and we will at some point dedicate a whole segment to it. But if you have a system that's set up to only publish the significant findings, as you say, you miss the ones where you miss the 10 studies that find that ice cream doesn't prevent whatever it was,
Brain cancer.
Quality of life.
and you just pick out the 1 in 20, let's say, that did find it, and you just ignore the rest because it doesn't get published because we select for studies that are statistically significant. So I have a whole diatribe I'm going to do on that. But I want to go back to a point you raised on, which is that you said you're looking for how does this fit into the body of literature, and I would say I agree with you. So that's sort of as you're reading through, the introduction is supposed to guide me towards what do we already know about this topic, where does this fit in, and then in the discussion, we sort of specifically say where does my study fit in, and I think that's really important because there's different ways of going about research. Some is that we come up with a hypothesis and we do some kind of a study to test it. In others, we just have data available to us and we come up with an idea and we test it, or we just look at data and see what's associated. And a lot of people are heavily critical of the last one. I think there are actually we're probably overly critical of it, but there's good reasons to be critical of it. But to me, the key thing that I'm looking for in the beginning of a paper is I'm looking for a question. Mm-hmm. Too often I read papers that there was no question. Nobody set out to answer a question. We just had some data available to us, and so we looked for associations. And sometimes that's fine because sometimes associations that you find correlate with meaningful things. In other cases, they don't correlate to anything. They're just sort of correlations that are interesting, but correspond even if you get rid of all the problems with misclassification and confounding and all those things, they don't correspond to anything in the real world. So an example I often use with my students is there's studies that look at whether or not prenatal surgery to repair for kids who have a form of spina bifida, whether prenatal surgery to repair the problem is better than postnatal surgery. And what they do is you have observational data, meaning no intervention. We just look at patients who got the prenatal and patients who got the postnatal, and we compare them, and we find one's better than the other. And even if you have none of the other problems, none of the bias problems, that doesn't correspond to anything in the real world because, by definition, the kids who survived to birth to be able to have postnatal surgery are different from kids who got prenatal surgery. Right. And you've excluded all the kids in the other group who would have died had they not gotten the prenatal surgery. It doesn't tell us anything about what we should do. And that's ultimately, to me, what the goal here is, to figure out what do we do? How do we improve the health of populations? And that's to me, that's the first thing I'm looking for is, was there a question? And is it a question worth answering? And
I think the rubric for that is if you torture the data long enough, it will admit to anything.
It will admit to anything.
Just let it speak, Don.
Just let it speak.
Yeah, although there were many who say the data cannot speak for themselves, that it is impossible, and therefore you must speak for the data in some way. But we can come back to that one later. So to summarize, I think what I would say here is that when we look at the literature, we're trying to read it with a critical eye to figure out what is it. What is it they're trying to answer? What did they do and how did they do it? And then where does it fit into the bigger picture of what we already know about this topic? And do the findings make sense? And there's ways that we go about thinking about that. Critically, we think about sources of bias, which we don't have a lot of time to go into and we'll do another time. But and we use all that information to try and draw reasonable conclusions. And I will just say for my own, I often end with the need more research conclusion. Because I often think it's, we don't want to draw sweeping conclusions based on the results of a single study. Okay, so moving on, we're going to move on to our third segment, which is, of course, our most fun segment, our amazing and amusing segment. We want to highlight some things that made us enjoy our jobs even more than we already do. We'll look at the weird and wacky things that happen in our field or the fields that surround us, as well as those things that inspire us. What do you got?
All right. I have a paper that was published by C.M. Vinke, L.M. Gogin, and W. Vanderlei.
Apologies on the pronunciations.
Yes, please. I apologize for the macerating the pronunciations. From the University of Utrecht, which was published in Applied Animal Behavior Science, and the title of this article is, "Will a hiding box provide stress reduction for shelter cats?"
A hiding box.
A hiding box, yes.
Sheltered cats.
And so, in essence, what they did was they were looking for an intervention that would minimize the stress associated with stray cats that are brought into a shelter. And they did a randomized controlled trial. It wasn't very large,
right.
but it was 10 cats in one arm, 9 cats in the other arm. And
randomly allocated the arms.
Randomly
I
allocated the arms.
assume each one of those cats signed a consent form.
No, I don't think so. I
Okay,
think they probably just
just
gave a
checking.
paw print. They didn't actually sign
Just
it.
checking.
Yeah. And so what they did is that when they brought these cats into the shelter, the intervention arm, they gave the cat a box. Just a brown cardboard box.
I'm in.
Because cats love boxes.
Because
Everybody knows
cats,
that.
I didn't know this, and
Cats
this is
love
something.
boxes.
I'm not a
you're
cat person. No, I'm not a cat person, so I didn't know this. So
Yeah.
I learned a tremendous amount. They gave the cats a box, and then what they did is they did an evaluation of the stress level of the cat. And they used something called a cat stress score, which I
yeah.
had never heard of
Oh,
before.
no. We use that all the time at home. Yep.
Yeah. So
Yep.
it has 7 different categories going from fully relaxed, weakly tense, very tense, fearful, stiff,
Very thorough.
very fearful, and terrified. And I love this
If
cat.
a cat is terrified.
Well, it's crouched directly on top of all fours. It's shaking. It's motionless. It has a plaintive meow and is
Plaintive.
yowling, growling, or quiet.
Okay, I didn't know
Its
that.
whiskers are back. The ears are fully flattened on the back of the head. The eyes are fully dilated. So there's a whole series of characteristics. There's body,
right.
stomach, legs, tail, head, eyes, pupils, ears, whiskers, vocal.
They were thorough. They were
love
thorough.
it.
Okay,
I love it.
what did they find?
And they found that a box given to cats markedly decreases the level of stress as indicated by this cat stress score. So the take-home message is that if you think that your cat is being stressed at any point, you give it a box, or you can give it a brown paper bag from the grocery store.
like those too.
Or apparently you can take masking tape and you can put
I tried that. It did not work.
you can make a square on the floor, and the cat will sit in that square
And
in
feel
the
less
floor.
stressed.
And feel less stressed.
Unfortunately, I tried that at home with my cat because I heard about the study too, and I actually taped a square on the floor, and the cat looked at it and walked away.
Maybe
But
the
my cat is very
maybe the cat
relaxed.
wasn't
My
stressed.
cat is very relaxed.
That's anecdotal.
Do we know? No, I hate
One more thing. If you put the box up high, the cat gets de-stressed much more quickly.
Well, no, I mean, obviously. That makes
Obviously, I didn't know that.
everybody knows. that
Because it's like a den.
high boxes are way better for...
I'm
do we
just
know?
so feline ignorant, I gotta say.
Do we know if this works for people?
We don't, but that's a great idea.
I think, I
that's
would
our
feel
next
less stressed.
NIH grant.
Okay.
I love
Okay.
it.
It would have to be an awfully large box.
The thing
All
is,
right,
the funny thing
cats.
about this is that I actually totally believe this study, whereas
Even
I'm
though
rather
it was-
skeptical about the obesity study.
Even though there's only 10
Total bias.
I
10 cats.
totally believe it because
cats and you're in.
because it's a predator. It's an animal that lives in the wild. Of course, they want to have like a den where they can be safe from enemies. It totally makes sense.
You just invalidated everything you said about
did.
being cynical and stuff wanting to be disproven.
well, all right.
Okay,
All right.
Don Thea, cats in boxes.
Cats
Got
and
it.
boxes. So
Chris Gill, what do you got?
I've got platypus venom. And
don't
why,
we all?
Why this is? Yeah, I don't personally because platypus venom. Did you know that male platypuses
There's nothing
have
about
venom?
there's nothing because of the name. There's nothing about a platypus that's not funny.
That is true.
That's true.
true.
Male platypuses is only
Is this?
platypuses. No, because it's Greek. So it is not the plural of puss is pusses in Greek. Whereas if this was Latin, it would be platypi. But it's
know this?
Greek. It's the same with octopus. The plural of octopuses is octopuses.
How do you know
It
this?
is not octopi.
It is. It's not. It's octopuses.
Everybody thinks it's octopi.
No, it's wrong.
Majority rules on this one, octopi.
Puss is a Greek root.
Okay.
Pod is the
moving
Latin.
Anyway, that is not your study. Go ahead.
Anyway,
Matt is laughing. You don't hear anything, but he's laughing.
so male platypuses have spurs on their hind legs which inject a powerful venom. And one of the leading components of the venom is amino acids that are right enantiomers. They're
Antimers?
right-handed enantiomers.
Antimers.
So for those
What's
of
an
you,
antimer?
and it's got nothing to do with anteaters. It has to do with stereochemistry, and that has nothing to do with rock and roll.
This has got to be the most esoteric topic out of college chemistry that
We're
you
going
can
somewhere with
possibly
this.
talk about.
We're going somewhere.
If you do you're making a XYZ axis with your fingers. And your left and right hands, you can see that they are mirror images of each other. Your hands are mirror images of each other. And molecules in nature come in left and right-handed versions of each other.
Okay.
And so all animals, all mammals, not animals, but all mammals, their amino acids, which are the building blocks of all proteins, are left-handed amino acids. They are all left-handed amino acids. Platypus venom is filled with a concoction of right-handed amino acids, which means that they're mirror images of it's like the L-alanine and the R-alanine. Now, the reason this stuff is so poisonous is because all of your cells are constantly making proteins, and you throw in a bunch of right-handed amino acids, and all of a sudden the physical structure of the protein is messed up because it can't bind. Because all
Faulty bricks in the construction.
Exactly. All the Legos of the heads are pointed in the wrong direction and they won't stack. And so it's like a universal toxin that will attack almost any mammalian process. It's really kind of fascinating. And the reason I thought that this was interesting is because this is how we structure most of our HIV drugs. The whole the nucleotide reverse transcriptase inhibitors are a whole class of molecular mimics whose stereochemistry has been tweaked slightly so that when they're incorporated into the growing cDNA strand of an HIV virus, they grab like an azidothymidine instead of a thymidine, right? And stick it in there, and it doesn't fit because the stereochemistry has been altered.
Wow.
And really the platypus is doing exactly the same thing. It's just injecting a whole bunch of decoy ducts into its host that is going to mess up all of its protein synthesis. And I just thought that was a fascinating analog to our whole first range of HIV drugs, which are the AZT and DDI and DDC and D4T and 3TC and FTC and tenofovir. They all work on exactly the same principle.
Wait a second. I thought we were supposed to be talking about articles. That's not an article. You're just
fun-
riffing on a
fun thing.
fact of
It's
nature.
an interesting.
We're allowed to include that?
I'm going to allow it. Yep.
Thank you,
I'm
Matt.
going to allow it.
Wow.
Thank you,
All
Matt.
right. So it's
Sorry.
wide open now.
So Chris Gill and platypi,
Platypuses.
whatever. Whatever. All right. I grabbed a study from the British Medical Journal's Christmas edition. You all know about
love
the
it.
Christmas edition.
Love it.
So for those of you who don't know, the Christmas edition of the British Medical Journal publishes amusing articles that people have done. And I particularly like this one, both because it involved a co-author from my department here in the Department of Epidemiology, but also because
Who is?
Jennifer Eider. But also because it goes back to the topic that I love to always come back to, which is p-values, except that in this case, P is spelled P-E-E. So the title of the article is Sniffing Out Significant P-Values, Genome-Wide Association Study of Asparagus, and I don't know how to pronounce this word.
Anosmia.
Anosmia. Okay, tell me what anosmia is.
You can't smell.
Can't smell.
You can't smell. Your nose doesn't work.
Okay, so this goes to the issue that apparently some people, when they consume asparagus, notice that afterwards their pee smells funny.
Who
Peculiar.
doesn't? Who doesn't?
Okay, I'm not going to name names, but I have asked around and I have met some people who do not smell it.
Seriously.
You know that in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's book, Love in the Time of Cholera, he talks about this constantly.
The smell of
They have
have
urine
some,
after
they have some references
They have
in
some
that.
great references to
Right.
some historical takes on the smell that asparagus
All the way back to the Greeks, right?
comparts to. Well, I believe it's called asparaguses.
Yes, he's
When
right.
it's
on
in the
that one.
Greek. That's right. So what they did was, and what I love about this is actually a serious study, although I've been assured that your taxpayer dollars were not used to fund it because it was done with data that was already available, and they were just using it to answer this question because apparently the authors noticed that some people could not smell the smell, while others noticed that it's a very pungent odor. And so they had reason to believe that there may, in fact, be a genetic reason for this. And the question is actually an interesting one. The question is, does the person not make the particular compound that has the smell, or are they not able to smell it?
But that's easy enough to figure out. Just smell other people's pee.
Well, so they actually talk about that. There were some prior studies in which they had somebody else's pee being smelled. Yeah. I'd like to see the consent form for that study. But anyway. And so what they did was they had these genetic sequences on these people, and they had information about whether or not they had this particular anosmia. Anosmia, that's a thing that you guys in the medical world talk about.
Because sometimes if you get hit in the head, you develop
anosmia. Anosmia. And what they found was, in fact, there were genetic, what do you call them?
Anosmics?
No, genetic loci, genetic
alleles.
Alleles, whatever it is, that were very, very highly significantly associated with not being able to smell this, suggesting that, in fact, the issue is that it is genetic and that the issue is that you can't smell it, not that you can't produce it.
Right.
If I got it.
Isn't it in fact the case that there aren't two populations? It's just the one is the inability to smellers,
inability
as opposed
to smell.
Lacking the enzyme to secrete whatever the compound is.
But it's not an inability to smell. It's an inability to smell asparagus and pee.
Smell specifically.
So the question is, what else can't they smell and pee?
Oh, I don't know.
Broccoli?
I think this is really fascinating because it raises a whole host of questions. Because people also hate cilantro.
Well, that's
I
right
hate
there.
cilantro.
Right there.
I love cilantro
God,
and
I hate
celery. And people,
What?
I love celery.
the
And people
worst.
say it tastes bitter, and it's like, no, it tastes sweet. What are you
I've never
talking
heard
about?
about celery, but I've definitely heard from Don many times that cilantro tastes like metal.
No, it tastes like dishwashing soap.
Dishwashing
Really?
soap.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, I just find it has this lovely sort of lemony
In fact,
flavor.
there's a cilantro haters group on the internet.
There is.
Yeah, there's a blog. and
Okay,
it's
so
like-
we'll tweet out the handle to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry,
important.
cilantro people.
That's the end of our program. If you have any feedback, you can reach us on the Population Health Exchange website. You can reach us there and give us any feedback you have on this particular show, on the article that we talked about, or any topics that you'd like us to potentially take on in the future. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that you will download the next episode.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Cheers.